Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Authors on Mission podcast, where we dive deep into the stories behind the storytellers. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Craig Storti, an accomplished author whose mission has been to decode the complexities of cross-cultural communication for readers worldwide. He has a groundbreaking book, speaking of India, and also he just came out with another book too, The Hunt for Mount Everest. He even has a whole another guide called Sorry No English, among many other pieces out there. Craig has mastered the art of making complex cultural interactions accessible to everybody.
You, Danielle, it's a pleasure to be here.
To all of our listeners, I was just telling Craig how I was reading through his content, and Craig just has so many incredible stories to tell. You've been all around the world, and you not only experience the culture, but you've made an impact everywhere you've been. And just in the fact that you've been able to write these books and get them out there and teach everybody about these different cultures. I would love to just sort of start off a little bit talking to you about that, sort of like, what inspired you to kind of start writing your first book while you were out traveling? Sort of how did it come to be?
Well, my first book came about because, as you might know, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco when I was quite young. This was 10 years before, actually 15 even before I wrote a book. And I always wondered, I had a great experience, but I wondered, how does being in another culture change you? What actually happened to me? I knew I had been changed, but I didn't know how. And so the first thing I did when I came back was read all the books I could find at that time about the whole experience of crossing cultures. And one thing that but this is no offense to anyone, but they were all pretty academic. At that time, the field was just starting, and most of the people in the field were subject matter experts. So they were anthropologists or sociologists, and they worked for universities mostly. And so their writing was a bit academic. And I thought, there's room for something a little bit more conversational, more accessible to the man and woman in the street. And I thought, well, I had been an English major. I had written a lot. I was sort of a semi-journalist. And I thought, well, maybe I can make this accessible to more people. That first book, by the way, Danielle, was called The Art of Crossing Cultures. And I enjoyed writing it a lot. Writing comes fairly easy to me. I mean, I can't write all day long, but 3 or 4 hours, and then the words sort of stick. And so I thought that there's room in the field for a more layman, laywoman approach to these sophisticated concepts. And so that's when I decided to write my first book, which was I think it was 1990 that The Art of Crossing Cultures came out. And It was well received. And it did turn out to be a place for a less academic style to deal with these relatively sophisticated concepts.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. I mean, I think it's incredible because, not to say that it's been a long time since 1990, but that was before I was born too. So I think it's interesting that back then you couldn't just Google, like what to do when you get to Morocco, right? Like I went to Morocco myself with my boyfriend about 1.5 years ago for a couple of days while we were traveling around. And if we wanted to find a restaurant to go to or any activity, Google is the way to go, right? But for you, I mean, you had to of course you were there for a very different reason, but you were able to take your experiences and put them into print for the people who weren't able to kind of Google that thing. So did you find any particular challenge in sort of, taking that and putting it into print? You said you were a natural writer a bit, but I'm sure there's a lot of research involved.
There was some research, but the first book came to me rather simply because it's actually based on I happen to be a Buddhist, and in Buddhism, the essence of the religion, as the Buddha said, he talked about the Four Noble Truths, which is there's what's called suffering, sort of unsatisfactoriness. There's a cause for this, there's a way out of it, and there's a path leading out of it. And so I use that, it's a classic framework, to describe some of the problems people have when they encounter other cultures, what explains the problems, how can you resolve the problems, and then actually a technique That book, by the way, has recently been revised, year before last, a technique for applying the solution. And so, because I had this framework already in my mind because of Buddhism, it applied beautifully to the art of crossing cultures, which I should say, Danielle, it's aimed at people who go overseas to live and work for a year or two, either with business or foreign studies or something like that. And at the time, though that was the audience, business hadn't become really global yet, which it has long since after I started. And so my audience was people like me who had gone to live in Morocco for 2 years, and subsequently, by the way, went to live in Nepal for 2 years. And what was it like figuring out these differences, reacting to them, and how did you stop the cause, which is humans are sort of subjective. We expect people to be like us. And the reason that we expect that is because as long as you're in your own culture, people have always been like you. But of course, when you go to another culture, they're not like you. You don't have and they do things differently, and you're disappointed at best, maybe frustrated, maybe annoyed. And then the book takes you through that process. But at the time, there weren't so many. Business hadn't gone global. So now many of my clients are US businesses that are international. People aren't going anywhere, but they are dealing every day with people from other cultures. And so some of my later books were really a completely different audience, not the expatriate audience.
Understood, right. And you know what I'm noticing, from everything that you're talking about is that your writing and sort of like your message and your audience, all of it has evolved and adapted ever since, you started because, it went from just, a book, a guide for people living in those other countries. And now we've adapted to doing it almost on a virtual level where, people are able to chat with people all over the world at any time of the day. So I guess my question to you is it hard to adapt over the years like that? What do you need to do as a writer or as a business person to adapt to those sorts of changes?
Not so much as a writer, but I started my own intercultural communications training business. And as my clients changed, initially they were clients who were sending people abroad and wanted them to be prepared for the experience. But more and more, the clients changed to business schools, for example, people getting MBAs, and then corporations. And as the clients changed, of course, my focus had to change because these people were no longer going anywhere. They were staying at their desk in Chicago or New York, but they were on the phone every day or on the internet every day with people in India, with people in Brazil, and they had to understand them. And so I had to change the focus of my trainings, not to how do you adjust to another culture, but how do you work with somebody 10,000 miles away with a very different mentality. Some of the same concepts are there, but the approach had to be very practical. Business people want results, and they want to see that this kind of training leads to differences that matter. And so it became a bit more practical, a little bit less kind of theoretical and analytical. So in terms of the writing, my writing style didn't change. I used more stories as I learned, as I did more workshops. I incorporated more real examples into my work, into my writings. But what really changed was the needs of the client, and hence the way I presented the same themes, but in a way that worked for that kind of audience.
Okay, I understand that. So I almost want to branch off into two directions right now. One direction I kind of want to dig into almost your strategies and theories, in working with different cultures. But then I also want to kind of go back to talking about the stories that you just mentioned, because that's also very interesting and a good segue into your other book too with Mount Everest. But first, I wanted to talk to you about just kind of something I relate to with that, because as a podcast host, as an angel writer, well, we call ourselves angel writers over ghost writers here at Authors on Mission. But I talk to people all different time zones, all different cultures. So I understand how there's a gap between that too. And I know what your clients are dealing with. And it's great that you're able to target them in very specific ways. And just very interesting. I was looking through your book, Sorry, No English, a little bit. And I noticed that some of the tips that you had there were just presented so straightforward, so easily pick up and understand. Like, for example, the idea of that, like, if somebody just said, like, nods their head and says, like, yes, yes, it doesn't mean that they understand you necessarily. So I just think that's really interesting. Did you, coming up with these sort of approaches, is it mainly on your own experiences, or Did you do any sort of like research to come up with these, or how did you come up with these ideas? I guess that's how I'm going to ask that.
Sure. Are we talking about Sorry No English?
Yes, yeah, right now I
Yeah.
was, yeah, but I know that your workshops, it's all based on very similar concepts.
Well, yeah, Sorry No English is there's a cultural element to it. Um, when I lived overseas, not when I was a volunteer, but later when I was married and living in Nepal and doing some work in other countries, I would come across Americans who they just wouldn't adapt their speech to the level of the host country person who often was maybe if not fluent, certainly bilingual, but didn't
Mhm.
know a lot. And then people who were less than bilingual. And some people I saw they were really good at adapting to the what they perceived was the level of the other person. Some had no clue and they just spoke to Nepalis or Moroccans or Sri Lankans the way they'd speak to the neighbor next door. And I thought, there's a better way to do this. And then I began adding a segment in the workshops that I give in the Washington, D.C. area to a lot of the local counties that are very multicultural. The counties are very multicultural, and the people in my workshop are the county employees who are now working with probably 15, 20 different nationalities, whoever comes in the room, whoever comes in the door. And so I started a segment in my workshop, my one-day workshop, about these tips for people with limited English. And it was so popular. At the end of the workshops, I used to do always do a survey. What's the thing you remembered the most today, or how did you benefit the most? And I was expecting people to say this cultural insight or that cultural insight. And they all said, oh, it was the language segment. There was the language segment. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of interest out there. People loved it. And then I thought, well, maybe I can make this into a book. And I tried to do research, but there really wasn't a book on that particular subject. And so most of the ideas I came up with were just from my own experience. And it's been quite popular. It's very popular in the workshop, but also I think the book has sold maybe 4 or 5 thousand copies now. But it's so much fun to do it. I think you're going to ask me what are some of my favorite tips, which I can get into, but I'll let you ask the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would love to ask that question. I guess I just wanted to make the point, though, that the fact that you were able to identify a need in the world and one that was so easily filled by that book, just handing it to somebody and being able to say, okay, these are the tips that you need when, adapting your language. It's you've found a problem and you're able to solve it. And I just think that's, a great tip for all of our listeners right now who are also aspiring authors. That's the way to come up with your stories, your books, right? You need to solve a
Yeah, yeah.
problem. That's how you're going to get those millions of copies sold, like you did.
Yeah,
So,
identifying a need is a great way to get an idea for a book. And
mhm.
as our world changes so rapidly these days with AI and the internet and Zoom, etc., the new needs are springing up everywhere. And if people can just identify one and then come up with a solution, I don't think it should be that difficult. And there's an audience for there's an audience for a lot of these needs. People want to know how to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something I really admire about you because you not only found that problem too, but you were able to find something that you were so knowledgeable about just by nature, by your experiences in the Peace Corps, that it was something you already had in your head and your experiences. You were the perfect fit to write that book to solve that need. I think it just lined up so perfectly. Um, and I think that's just the one reason why everything you've written has been so successful. So that's something to think about too. I mean, for our listeners, find an experience, find something you're good at, use that to fill the need too. I think it's very something to think
Yeah,
about.
yeah. Oh, just coincidentally, tomorrow I'm doing one of those workshops for one of my regular clients is the fire and rescue department of a local county. And these are all real American men and women, and they haven't traveled very widely. But they answer calls to all different types of families all around the county. And a lot of these people, I think 30% of Loudoun County is people not born in the United States. So they're speaking limited English. Here are these emergency situations. They don't have time to taste. And if the people don't understand them when they speak to them, to the fire and rescue folks, things stop and they can't stop. These are emergencies. And so this is one audience that just loves these tips because they make a huge difference in an emergency situation. In a normal situation, you have time to fool around, rephrase something, but there's no time when you're responding to an emergency. So they love this content because the need is enormous.
Well, Craig, I have to say, you kind of just blew my mind there because now we're not just talking about tips for people working on Zoom calls, but actual life and death situations. So you're not only making impact for people in everyday life, but in these like situations where you need to know it. That's something I didn't even think about is that whole, when my eyes widened when you said that it was for the fire, because I knew where you were going with that. Like it becomes a whole new level of need in that way. That's very interesting.
I don't think I have an audience that appreciates this more than that audience. All the audiences appreciate it, but
Yeah.
they really get something extremely valuable out of it.
So I think this is a good time for me to branch into that. What is your favorite example of these tips? Because I would love to hear your example from the book, but also an example that you shared during those type of workshops too. Like what kind of phrases or knowledge do you need to know in those life or death situations, and also in your book too. So let's dive into that. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
Yeah, some of the examples that the particular county we're talking about is the suburb of Washington, D.C., and it has the largest percentage of non-U.S. folks are Indian by far, thousands of mostly professionals from India. One valuable tip that I give to my rescue people is that it turns out, and I know this from my book, Speaking of India, it turns out that people from India, especially southern India, they speak as their mother tongue. They also speak English. One of the four Dravidian languages that are spoken in southern India. And it so happens that those are the world's fastest languages. When anybody is speaking to anybody else in one is called Tamil, one is called Malayalam, one is called Telugu, and the other is called Kannada. They're speaking faster than anybody in the world. Now, those folks, when they switch to English to talk to us, there are natural tendencies to speak really fast. And a lot of folks who haven't heard Indians talk before don't understand them. And so here you are, you've answered an emergency call at somebody's home, somebody's speaking perfect English, you don't understand anything, and it's quite tense. And what makes it especially difficult, Danielle, is that these folks speak beautiful English. It's not that they don't know English. They're very bilingual. And until they came to America, everybody always understood them when they spoke English because there were other Indians speaking English equally well. Now they come here, and for the first time in their life, somebody tells them, I don't understand you. Nobody has ever told them they didn't understand them when they spoke English because it was to other Indians. And so they get really frustrated. They think, what's this rescue guy's problem? The rescue guys think, I can't understand you. And here we are losing valuable time in an emergency situation. So that's a story that that's an example that I use.
Yeah.
And some of the tips that I think are important. The book has 50 tips, but probably the two easiest for folks to remember and actually to fix are the colloquial expressions, things like piece of cake and out of luck and on the fence. These are expressions where people know what the words mean. Indians know, let's just use Indians, limited English speakers know peace and they know cake. But you can't understand the expression just by adding up the words. The parts don't add up to the whole.
They're
So
probably wondering, why are we talking about cake right now?
well, an
Yeah,
Indian
but I
says
get what you mean. Yeah. You have to understand the meaning behind the metaphor.
you have to know the expression. You can't figure it out because you know the words. And of course, like many languages, we have hundreds of these, maybe even thousands. So one of my tips is don't use those. Try to catch yourself using them and try to rephrase. It's funny you should mention, an Indian told me the other day, oh, that's a piece of pie. And first I laughed, and then I realized what he'd done. He'd confused easy as pie with piece of cake. And then I thought, how often we have two expressions that mean simple, and they both
Yeah.
involve pastry.
Yeah.
But
Hey, Craig, have you ever seen Modern Family?
yes, yes.
Yeah, there's this episode where Gloria, the one character who doesn't speak good English, she calls it a
Yeah.
doggy dog world. instead of dog eat dog. Like just one example, right? There's a whole episode of like the way she said that. This made me think about it because it's really funny in contexts like that, right? But I can see
Yeah.
how a lot of the work that you do is much more serious than that, but it can be a little bit funny at times too. It can be enjoyable to kind of discuss that sort of miscommunication. So that's
Oh,
just
yeah,
another
some of
aspect
them,
of
they can be very amusing. I have an Israeli friend who always says, "Oh, every Harry, Dick, and Tom." And
mm.
of course, we don't say Harry, Dick, and Tom. We say Tom, Dick, and Harry. But she doesn't see
I
why
don't
the
think I even know
sequence.
that phrase. But I get
Oh,
what you mean,
oh,
yeah.
every Tom, Dick, and Harry mean kind of just every natural, normal person is a Tom, Dick, or a Harry. But and I also tell business audiences because a lot of folks are on conference calls with a global team, and they wouldn't be on a global team if they didn't speak good English. But the Americans on these teams often do use these expressions because the non-Americans speak English so well. They assume that they know all these expressions. And actually, those expressions aren't something that everybody who speaks English well necessarily knows. And so I tell them to be really careful about it. And actually, it's trickier. The other tip I wanted to mention is so there's these colloquial expressions where the problem is you know the words, but you don't know what it means. And then there are what are called phrasal verbs, Danielle. So a phrasal verb is a verb followed usually by a preposition. And again, for example, keep up. So most people know keep, limited English speakers. Most people know up, but how does that mean continue or don't stop? You either know that or you don't, but you don't know it because you know the meaning of keep and the meaning of up. Because when they're put together, they don't have the same meaning that they mean separately. Count on is another example. Most limited English speakers know count, they know on, but count on actually means rely or depend. It has nothing to do with counting. And so I also tell my business audiences be careful in your global conference calls. Be careful about using expressions that even people with really good English may not know.
Yeah, that's thank you for sharing that tip because that tip not only relates to the business world and to, and emergencies like we said, but also to the writing world as well. Like a lot of authors, especially people whose work books that I'm editing, they use phrases that not everybody might know, whether it
Right.
be for jargon in a certain industry, or maybe it's just really complicated phrasing that the average reader doesn't understand. So that's something to think about too, just in any context. If you want your book to reach the audiences globally, it has to be easily translated. And that's a whole other thing to think about too. Did you encounter that? I know your books are also in many different languages. Is that something that you consider?
No, the only book that's been, well, actually, I think a couple of my books. The Everest book has been translated into four languages. I don't know the process or how difficult it was, but I do know that my writing is, I try to make it as uncomplicated as possible, not dumbing it down, but just making it accessible to anyone. So I'm imagining, I don't really know, that the translators found that easier because there wasn't special use of English by and large in my books. If the concepts were a bit special, then I couldn't use different words. But the style I try to make as conversational as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you're able to do that. A lot of writers struggle with that, and that's something that we do at Authors on Mission is taking those manuscripts and helping it be more accessible, more marketable. Because, if you're a reader and you pick up a book and you don't know what you're reading, you're going to close
Yeah.
it. So I think that's
Yeah.
great that you were able to do that. That's actually another need that needs to be filled, just like you filled the need for your other books. Another need is to write to other audiences too. Something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever
Yeah.
considered writing a book like that? Sort of like how to write to
How
other
to write
cultures?
for, no, I haven't, but that's not a bad idea.
I wonder if that would be a concept worth exploring because, in the business world, for example, they're sending emails to those people worldwide, just as, as one example, newsletters that bosses send to their entire workforce. What if they don't quite understand what's being written? And maybe these are some tips to think about too. Just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, that's quite intriguing. I write a column for an intercultural newsletter. One of the articles I wrote was called The Native Speaker Advantage. And what that was about is that English is still the world's language. But in a lot of cases, native speakers, when they're speaking to non-native speakers, just because they speak English so easily, so quickly, so well, they have a real advantage in getting their points across because they can rephrase quickly, they can be especially eloquent, and somebody who's not quite bilingual can't make their points quite as well because of the language limitation. And hence, the native speaker sometimes prevails when actually the non-native speaker probably has a better idea, but because of the limits of the language, they can't make it as strongly, and hence it doesn't get adopted. And I encourage people in that article, if you're a native speaker, be sure to give non-native speakers you're dealing with plenty of time to explain themselves. Because if you show impatience, for example, then they'll just stop. And then they'll buy your idea when really theirs was better for both of you. And it's something that native speakers should keep in mind because it is the language of business for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that too. I think our audience would really benefit from hearing that because it applies to all of us. It really does. No matter if you're writing a book, writing an email, writing a newsletter, whatever, you need to be able to identify that some people have that advantage if they're able to naturally. You need to break it down and help everybody understand it.
And
And I think
give people plenty of opportunity to say, am I making myself clear? Have I given you a chance to explain your position? Don't just assume they're going to do that. Ask them if they've had the opportunity, because if you're the native speaker, you just naturally tend to dominate. And you don't want to leave the meeting without making sure that person has had a chance to either object to what you say, make it clear what their objections were, or reframe it. And just invite people at the end to say something before you end the conversation, because there may be something they just weren't able to get out, and you need to hear it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, well, first off, I do want to segue back to that, but I just had another personal example. I also work as a teacher, outside of my editing and writing and podcasting. The funny thing is we also have a lot of parents who come in for things like conferences and workshops, everything. And I see what you mean just by that. I've had to learn myself to ask those parents, do you understand what I'm saying about your child's progress, right? So again, applies universally. Another reason why your book resonated so much with everybody. The part I want to go back to though is one part of making a book accessible or making anything you're saying accessible is storytelling. And that's something that we mentioned earlier in our conversation that I wanted to come back to. I think this is a great time to kind of get into this. I noticed that your Everest book is a lot different than the others because it's very story-based. So I would like to kind of use this as our little transition into that book. What made you write about Everest and go from sort of one type of writing to that now? What inspired you?
Well, what inspired me was in 1980, I met my wife in Kathmandu, in Nepal. She's an American, but she was working there. And so I lived in Nepal for a couple of years after that. And I'd always been interested in the Himalayas as a young man, but living in Nepal, it was like sort of dying and going to heaven. And I was reading all these books about Everest. And to specifically answer your question, they all begin in 1921. Which was the first ever expedition to try to climb Everest. Well, Everest was discovered in 1853. So I was wondering, why do all these books start in 1921? What happened between 1853 and 1921? Why wasn't there attempts? I researched that. I knew some of the answer. And it gave me, to authors who might be listening, it gave me a hook. There's many books about Everest, but they all begin in 21. So I thought I'll write a book that ends in 1921. And coincidentally, here's another tip for your authors. Coincidentally, when I was discussing it, the publisher, John Murray, which is a Hachette brand, the first thing they said at the meeting, because this book came out I wrote it in 1919 and 1920. And it was published in 21, in 2019, 2020. 2021 was the 100th anniversary of the story that ends the book. The first thing the publisher said to me was, "We love anniversaries." And if your authors can keep in mind, if they're writing something and they can somehow tie it to a 50th or a 25th or a 75th, it is a hook. So that was a fun thing. But it's interesting. It's a very different departure from all my other books, which are about topics, not a story. And as you may, well, one thing I always try to do in all my books that aren't my culture books is to start each chapter with a story. And then the rest of the chapter ends up working its way back to that story. But you need something to pull the reader in right away. And that's true, really, whether you're writing historical nonfiction, which that is, or even my culture books. I often start a chapter with a story, and then the rest of that chapter explains the cultural issue that was illustrated in that story. So, to your point about storytelling, storytelling is essential, I think, for almost any kind of writing. People love stories, it pulls them in. And the trick in writing, or at least one of the tricks, is to pull people in, to have them thinking right away, well, this is interesting. I wonder where this is going. And then you've got them, at least if you continue to write well. And a story can be anything. It doesn't have to be a fairy tale. It can be, one time I was having coffee and, I mean, stories take any kind of form, but anytime you can tell a story, people love stories, and you can make them work in any fashion.
I 100% agree. A lot of my editing work and ghostwriting work involves storytelling. I get so many manuscripts that are just, again, jargon and you do this, do that. But when you think of a lot of times I have to go back to the client and be like, okay, like, when have you experienced this yourself? Let's add in a personal story to the beginning of the chapter. Just like you said, it's funny that we both on the same page about that, because it not only, interests the reader, but it also introduces the chapter's topic, and it kind of puts it in a relatable situation for the reader to understand. So 100% agree with you there. It's so important just throughout the book, or in the book as a general concept, like your Everest book.
People want to feel the person behind the writing. They want to have some sense of who this is. Regardless of what you're talking about, if the personality of the writer can somehow come through, not front and center, but people like to sense a person behind the book. And if they like the person, they'll keep reading the book. So anything you can do to, I don't want to overdo this, but to personalize your content, readers love that. They know this book wasn't written by a machine. It was written by a person. And they'd like to meet the person somewhere in that book, and stories are a foolproof way of doing that. But even just phrasing can do that. It may be a humorous phrase. They get the sense, oh, this guy's a lot of fun. They want to like the writer.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, would you rather sit in a lecture hall listening to a professor drone on, or would you rather sit down to a cup of coffee with your friends, right? Like, what kind of tone do you want to get from your book? It's all over the place. And that's something that, at Authors on Mission, I do all the time when I'm working on a manuscript. You need to individualize it. You need to personalize it. And you mentioned, like, I don't want to go too much on about that, but it's important to. It's actually one of the most important things you could do, because if your book looks like everybody else's, it's not going to stand out. That's what personalizing it's all about too, making it unique, finding your own brand.
I mean, people are by nature interested in other people. So if they get a feeling of another person when they're reading the book, that keeps them reading.
Yeah, 100%. And not only that, but I mean, for example, yourself, you've built yourself a following, an audience, based on the fact that you write about cultures and how to, communicate with others. That's sort of who you are, your audience, right? By being personal, like personalizing your content like that, you're able to draw more people to you because they know what they're expecting, what they would like to hear about it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. One question I do have to ask, though, and I'm sure you probably get asked a lot. Have you climbed Mount Everest?
Oh, no, I prefer to see mountains from below.
Okay.
We did go, my wife and I trekked, well, we were on our way to base camp, which is where as far as non-climbers usually go. I got sick on the way, and so we didn't make it all the way, but we were on the Everest trip, and then I did do other treks in Nepal, but I haven't climbed Everest.
Well, hey, you got closer than most people. You're almost there at base camp. That's incredible. I've heard it's actually these days very accessible to people. You just have to kind of get the right training, and maybe that's on my bucket list too.
No,
Something interesting I was curious about.
You just have to have enough money.
Yeah, I was joking about that with a friend the other day too. If you can buy the right equipment and the right training, it's you can get to the top of the world. Anybody can, I guess.
You've probably seen that famous picture of this long line of people waiting to summit Everest. It was 200 or 300 people. Now, most of them are not climbers. They don't know much about climbing. They pay 60, $70,000, and the trekking agencies in Nepal guarantee they'll get them to the top. And usually it's with a lot of help, but be that as it may, it's become very commercial and not the exception that it used to be.
And I guess that is what's unfortunate about it, as much as it's a incredible story and, a beautiful landmark of the whole world. I guess that's what happens these days. Even traveling anywhere, it's kind of just an easy
Yeah,
peasy, hop on a plane and go. It's sense of adventure is kind of lost these days. I
it really.
traveled the whole world last summer and I never had any problem getting around because one, I guess going back to your whole, brand, English is everywhere. So like that's just one fact, but it's also commercialized. I'm a tourist. They want to make it easy for me to spend my money. So
That's
just a whole
right.
nother fact. A little bit off topic, but I guess that's another reason why you have to sort of adapt what you're doing, adapt your writing to meet these different times. I'm sure a lot of the tips that you had in your first book back in 1990, yeah, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but it's not quite the same anymore because in a way it's a little bit easier, even though people don't always open their minds to changing it, like you said
Yeah.
before. So in terms of
Well,
communication.
um, my second book was, well, my third book, I think, was called The Art of Coming Home. And it was about repatriation after you've lived overseas for a couple of years on an assignment and you come back to your home country. And of course, you've changed tremendously. And it's not your home anymore. The place you just left, you made it your home. And to your point, that book was revised a couple of years ago, and I had to change it a lot because one of the original factors that had since changed was that when you were overseas for a couple of years, you were pretty isolated. There wasn't much contact except letters
Mhm.
with your loved ones back home. And now with the internet, you can have as much contact as you want, and so you're not so separated from your home. You know more about it, and when you come back, the shock is much less. In the old days, you hadn't had much contact, and you didn't really know what had happened while you were away. And I had to change that because that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point because that, again, that's another thing that I experienced myself. I was scrolling through Instagram just same as anybody. And we watched the new Barbie movie when we were in Greece, for example. Like, yeah, you can still see everything in the United States versus anywhere else these days. And the main difference is time zones, I guess. So just a very interesting
Yeah,
point that I guess what our listeners can kind of take from that is you have to be willing to adapt your books and go back and revise it too to keep it relevant and to keep your audience, interested in being able to pull information from it to keep your book alive. So it's something to think
yeah,
about.
yeah. You have to, yeah. And now do you have to keep up with your audience, and you can't be behind. They can't know more than you know.
Yeah. I guess kind of branching off of that, Craig, you mentioned that you have a workshop tomorrow. I'm curious, what other projects do you have on the horizon right now that maybe our listeners would be interested in? Are you working on any new books recently or anything of that sort?
Yes, I have. I'm working on another Everest book called Our Mountain, which is what the British called Everest, because Everest was discovered in 1853 and it wasn't climbed until 1953. So that's 100 years. And for all but two of those years, the only the only people who were allowed to climb Everest were the British. And so it did become, and everybody else wanted to. The Swiss wanted to, the Italians, the Germans, the French, but the Tibetans wouldn't allow anybody in except the British. And so they had this monopoly. And so I'm writing the book about how this monopoly eventually they lost it. And it's quite an exciting story. But so it's going to cover the history of Everest from 1853 to 1953. And that book is probably, maybe it's about half done. Again, to my point about anniversaries, I'm timing it for 2028, which is the 75th anniversary of 1953. So in England, at least, it'll be a big deal because 75 years ago, Sir Edmund Hillary climbed Everest. And so I'm hoping the publisher will think that this is another good anniversary to celebrate. I also have written, but I haven't been able to sell, a book on Annapurna, which is another a mountain in Nepal. It was the first giant, as they're called. There's 16 mountains in the world higher than 8,000 meters. And the first one ever climbed was this one called Annapurna, and it was a very dramatic story. The French did it. But so far, I haven't been able to sell it. The British publisher who published The Hunt for Everest said, oh, it's too French. And others have said, oh, it's an obscure anniversary because 2025 is the 75th anniversary of that climb. And so, but to your authors, keep trying. I think I've sent it to 10 places now, and I think somebody will publish it, but you have to keep trying. I don't know. I guess it depends on what you're trying to sell, but don't give up.
For all of our listeners right now, again, the anniversary concept is another amazing tip. You know, if you're in a field and you know there's some sort of event coming up, mark that as your deadline. And Craig, I don't know if you know this, but Authors on Mission, we're also a publishing company. We're based in New York. We have a lot of bestsellers out there. So I mean, maybe we can chat after this, because if people keep rejecting that idea, that sounds interesting to me. I mean, maybe that's something I can help you out with. We can figure that out. But
it's a great story. It's much more dramatic than the conquest of Everest, which was pretty much a cakewalk compared to Annapurna. And the French did it. They had so much against them. No one was worried. They knew they'd never do it, and they did. It's a very dramatic story, but it's just when depending on the editor that gets your proposal, that's the result you're going to get.
I mean, I don't know how anyone can think something like climbing mountains is not, worthy of a book. I think that's, an incredible story that anybody would be interested in. We'll chat after this a bit. I would love to see what I can do with you for that. But kind of going back to our listeners, I mean, all you have to do is come up with a story, an idea, a need to be filled. Get your idea out there, right? I mean, Craig, how has your life changed since you started writing books? I mean, I'm sure you got your message out to so many different people. Do you see a lot of, I guess, obviously positive reviews and feedback for people's lives you've changed? Tell me a little about that. Has that been an experience of yours?
Yeah. Not so much. Well, my favorite book is my Everest book, actually, just because I love that story. But I get more letters, more heartfelt emails, I should say, from people out of all my books. The one that I just mentioned, called The Art of Coming Home, which is about repatriation, when you come back to your home country after living overseas. And I think it's because people are so grateful that somebody out there understands this and is able to tell them, you're not crazy. This is natural. And what you're going through is what everybody goes through. And I get the most heartfelt letters from people saying, thank you for telling me that it wasn't me, that it wasn't something wrong with me, that there's a process, and just explaining that. So I do get emails. I get emails mostly, so The Art of Coming Home. I've written several books that are based on what's called cross-cultural dialogues. There's short conversations. There's several of those in Speaking of India, by the way. Short conversations between two speakers where, if you can see it, people make a mistake, but people don't see it. And they think, wow, I could have had that conversation. And then I describe what was the assumption you made that was incorrect. And people love that. In my workshops, it's the centerpiece of my workshop. Several of these exchanges where people think they've understood the other person and think the other person's understood them, and neither one has understood the other. And the words are right there in front of you. You should be able to see it, but you can't because you project. And so I get a lot of letters about the dialogues, how effective they are as a teaching tool. And as I say, they form the heart of my workshop, because people read them and think, what did I miss? And then we go through and they say, oh my God, people have stopped me or have come up to me and said, I had that conversation yesterday.
That's so really funny. And I know you literally open up Sorry No English with that story, or those sort of stories. It's compelling because you're right. It happens to all of us. And I guess that's just, again, the main reason why I think what you've done here is just so incredible. It's meaningful, it drives change, it applies to everybody, it solves that problem. It's incredible. I guess from there, I'm wondering, well, first off, actually, do you happen to have any copies of your book with you right now? Or any of your books?
Yes.
Can you show it to us? Let's see what it looks like. Let's see the covers.
Here's Sorry No English.
Oh, okay. I like that cover design. We have sort of two color tones in the dialogue box, almost separated, but they're joined by a circle. I like that symbolism there, kind of. We're
Yeah.
connected, but separate. I like it.
I
So there you
haven't
go,
heard
guys. You
really,
can find that on Amazon. I found it myself there, really easy. You said you have a
and
couple others.
this
Oh,
is
there's
the
the
Everest,
Everest.
which is a great cover, I think. I didn't have anything to do with any of these covers, but this one is kind of a 19th century travel type drawings, and I think it's a great cover, actually.
Are you telling me you didn't have anything to do with the own covers of your books?
No, well,
I guess
people,
I'm kind of curious. Somebody just made it for you and you were like, okay, looks good.
well, people will show me, usually not always, people will show me maybe one, sometimes just one example, and do I like it or not? I
Mm.
think once in a while I've been shown two sample covers, but I'm not an artistic kind of person, so I don't have ideas for covers. I like certain ones better than others, but no, I didn't have much input. I don't know. In my experience in publishing, the author doesn't get that much input into the cover,
Mm.
but maybe it's different with your group. This is the India one, by the way. We've talked
Oh,
about.
yes, yes, let me see.
Maybe we're going to talk about, speaking of India. I kind of like this one, actually.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about it. So I read like the summary of it a bit, but I didn't quite dive too much into it. Can you tell us a little bit to our listeners right now? What exactly do we dive into here?
So speaking of India, came about because you folks that are younger than 25 won't know this, but when the year 2000 was approaching, everybody thought computers were going to go crazy because of some, I don't know why, but that when we stopped being in the 19s, when it were going to be the 20s, a lot of adjustments would have to be made to software. And so they started hiring folks in India to help them prepare for the year 2000. And a lot of these folks were my clients because they were dealing now regularly with folks in India, for a lot of them for the very first time. And there were a lot of cultural differences coming up. And because I lived in Nepal, which is a Hindu culture, I knew about the culture. And so I just started doing workshops on that subject. And then I heard so many stories that it was very easy to, and I knew what the major challenges were. And so those were the chapters. And the stories just kept coming. Every workshop I gave, somebody would tell me a new story, and I would put that in the book. So that's what that book came from. That was also recently updated. My publishers, they don't like a book to be, I think maybe it's 10 or 15 years old without revising it and bringing in something new. They think it'll sell better. And so recently I've updated 3 of my books, and speaking of India was a 4th one. So that's something authors may be curious to know about, is that if they have a book that sells well, or that sells, it doesn't have to sell that well, then they might be prepared. They might be collecting things for an update, for revised, because if a book is selling pretty well and it's 10 years or older, publishers are going to want it to be updated. And so authors who have something that's doing well for them, they might start collecting things for the revision, because if it's doing well, they're going to be asked to revise it.
Understood. Okay, so that's something that our other listeners can take home today too, is to be ready to revise it. Sort of like we mentioned before,
Yeah.
but be prepared for it, right? Continue collecting that data so that you can bring life back into your book as you need to go. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing those covers too. I think it's important for our listeners to get a glimpse of those too, so they could search it out in the bookstores and on Amazon and everything. So it's great.
Yeah.
And speaking of finding you more, you mentioned you do workshops. How can our listeners, if they're interested in booking with you or joining your workshops or anything else, how can they get in contact with you? How can we find you?
Well, probably the easiest way is probably my website. I am on LinkedIn, but my website, which is craigstorti.com, it has all my books and all my workshops. And that's how most people who don't know me, that's how they find me. Or they bought a book for some reason, and then my email is in most of the books. So I would say go to my website.
Perfect. Okay. And everybody listening, we're going to have those links in the description box too, so you can find those easily if you think that maybe you work somewhere that needs training just like this, or even if you want to buy copies of the book to distribute to your workplaces as well, or even if you're just interested in learning a little bit more about Everest, for example. I mean, if you have content that kind of matches anybody's needs. I mean, honestly, I'm about to suggest buying copies of Sorry No English for my fellow teachers at my school, right? Because I think anybody can benefit that, especially people working in a very diverse school who need to communicate on a daily basis to people of all ages and cultures. It's very important stuff. So again,
Yeah,
listeners, check out your content. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a neighbor down the street who substitutes in a primary school just over the border here in Pennsylvania. And she loves Sorry No English because a lot of the students, the children in that school are not born in the US and they speak some English, but the other teachers don't know how to talk to them. And Mary, when she found out about the book, took it to work and showed it to people. And I'm guessing that maybe those little kids were improved by that because maybe some of the teachers were speaking to them more carefully. And, it gives people confidence if they don't speak a language that well. A native speaker speaks to them and they understand that. It really gives them confidence because most of the day they're in situations where they don't understand and they lose their self-esteem because they can't understand. Somebody makes the effort to talk to them in a way that they will understand. It really builds confidence, which only adds to their ability to speak English better.
Yeah, I mean, Craig, in addition to the idea of writing a book tailored to writing for different cultures, you should probably write a book about teaching, in different cultures, like how to communicate to the students and families too. I think the families, the whole like ballpark to dive into too. That could be a whole book on itself. I've had so many situations where a parent just doesn't fully understand, what the event is or what we're saying for the conference is. Or I've had, one parent walk into my classroom thinking I was their child's teacher, for example, not under things like that. Maybe a whole nother ballpark for you to dive into.
I have
So,
a very funny teacher story for you.
oh,
It's on the
please.
cultural angle, but another Peace Corps volunteer friend of mine in Morocco, he lived in a village and it was a farming community. And in Morocco and in a lot of countries in the Middle East, teachers are very high status profession. And you should act according to somebody of that status. And one day in his village, there was a holiday, and all of his students were out helping thrashing the wheat. And so the head man in the village was assigning everybody to different jobs, either cutting or collecting or trimming. And so my friend, who was a teacher, got in line, and he got up to the head man, and he said to the head man, "Where's my place?" And the head man said, "In the classroom." So my friend was a teacher in that
Okay,
village. And
right.
so everybody knew he was a teacher. But on this particular event, where everybody in the village was helping cut the wheat,
Mm.
everybody was lining up to get their job.
He
And
thought
so
he was supposed to go and join them.
he thought, I live in this village, I should do my part. And so we
Mm.
got up to the headman and said, "So where's my place?" And the headman said, "Well, in the classroom." He shouldn't be doing
Understood.
manual
Right, right.
laborers
Yeah.
here, but
Yeah, I mean, situations like that happen all the time where you don't even quite understand. I mean, even right now, I didn't quite get like what was happening because I wasn't there for the moment. But it's
yeah.
funny how you need to be able to relate those stories and communicate effectively no matter what the situation is. So,
Right.
so yeah, I mean, again, I think this is all very incredible stuff, and I think that our listeners have learned so much from you today. I mean, the main point being find a need and fill it. Put your book out there in order to fill that need, and that's how you're going to get that growth and how you get that audience. Make it personable, like you mentioned before. An amazingly important fact as well. And I guess
That's
I
good.
must ask, do you have any last piece of advice you'd like to share with our audience today that they can kind of take home with them and perhaps to put into action? What can we think
One thing
about?
I've, one thing I've learned, maybe it's just me, but I find that after about 2 or 3 hours, I need to stop writing because the language still comes, but it's not as clever or it's not as strong. And I find if I go away and actually go away for a while, not just an hour or so, but until later in the day, then I'm fresh again and I can write again. So for me, it really works not to write much longer than a couple hours. I can just feel that the sentences aren't coming easily anymore. And I could still write, but the quality would diminish. And when I go back and look at what I did when I kept on writing, I have to junk it because it's just not good anymore. So, and this may be a personal thing, but I think there is a point where the language just stops coming for a while and just go away, and not for an hour or two, but 3 or 4. You really need a long time to recharge, and then do it again. But don't write longer than you should.
Thank you for that tip. I think that's something that all writers and all authors could definitely apply into their life. I wrote a blog post about that recently too, because, in order to get your best writing done, to overcome writing block, you need to have those breaks, not only to refresh your mind, to get new ideas, and, you can't pour from an empty bucket. It's another one of those sayings we talked about the other. It's just one of those things that you might understand, but you need to have a fresh mind to put those words onto the page. So I like that a lot. That's a very important thing for people to take home with them today. So with that, I think that wraps up our conversation with you, Craig. And to all of our listeners, today on this podcast, we've journeyed through Craig's writing career from his early days, working in the Peace Corps, working and writing guides to his latest works, now are, storytelling books. I think that whatever book and whatever topic you're interested in Craig's whole repertoire here, you're going to find something that you're going to find meaning from and love. So take a look at his website on Amazon, look into scheduling workshops with him. And Craig, thank you for sharing your journey with us. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on another episode of Authors on Mission. We're here to celebrate writers who are making a difference through their words. And until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and keep sharing stories that matter. This is your host, Danielle Hutchinson, signing off. Thank you for watching. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.